The first seminar looked at mobilisation. Not only the mobilisation of army, which was a huge task. In 1938, there was around 3,000 permanent officers and soldiers in the Australian Army. We had a militia of 80,000. That mobilised to around 700,000, with 400,000 soldiers serving overseas. So we discussed that. We also discussed the mobilisation of our industrial base, because that was quite important. And the issues that we had with that mobilisation created significant friction at the tactical, operational and strategic level for our nation. It was 900 days exactly between Menzies' declaration of war in 1939 and the bombing of Darwin. The bombing of Darwin, there was no aircraft from the RAAF to defend Australia. Despite the RAAF being formed 20 years prior with the express task of defending Australia from attack from the north, probably from the Japanese. So despite the fact that we knew what the likely threat was, we were unprepared to meet that. That's why I like this painting here. This is Wilbert Darky Hudson, a gunner who was there at Darwin on that day. There he is with his Lewis gun, probably not his primary choice of weapon, defending the airbase at Darwin. For his actions, he received a military medal. But I think this is really representative of what can happen, because not only was Gunner Hudson caught with his pants down, but Australia, when we came to defend our continent, was caught with our pants down as well. So, with that, I will ask Dr. Bailey to come to the podium. So, Dr. Mark Bailey joined the Royal Australian Naval College in 1979, and he served aboard a variety of vessels, including the aircraft carrier HIMARS Melbourne and the frigate HIMARS Yarra. He completed his doctorate at the ADFA, at the Defence Force Academy in 2019, and his thesis was the strategic and trade protection implications of Anglo-Australian maritime trade, 1885 to 1942. He specialised in intelligence at the Maritime Intelligence Centre and the Joint Intelligence Centre before transferring to the RAAF as an intelligence officer. He's written a wide range of papers around naval strategy and strategy in general.
Thank you. It's quite an honour. It is quite an honour to be here again, especially for a second time. James, if I start to run over, please start throwing things at me. I can be a bit thick with that sort of thing sometimes. So, on behalf of the ANI, ADFA and myself, thank you for inviting me. What we're going to be looking at is generating national power in the island state. Now, this covers a little bit of the same ground as was covered during the first one of these seminars, mostly because we're talking about the same era, but it's a very different slant on it. Basically, I'm a member of the Australian Naval Studies Group at the Defence Force Academy still, a reserve officer in maritime trade operations, obviously, all my views are my own. I'm also the Australian end of the Corbett 100 group. We've run 4 international conferences. The last was last December in the École Navale in Brest in France. And I run the International Corbett Forum. So my area of academic expertise is protection of maritime trade. Why is this important? Because we're an island. And there's only been 2 people crazy enough to study this particular subject ever. There's only 2 PhDs on it, and poor old Brian Ranft died in 2003. So when it comes to, if you like, SMEs on the subject of how do you protect maritime trade and why, I'm kind of it. My supervisor insists that I blow my own trumpet about that because it amuses him, so I'm not going to do that. Merely notice that particular point. If you don't understand maritime trade, you don't understand that we're an island, then you can't understand how to defend this country. Because you don't have to invade Australia to defeat it. All you have to do is cut off a thing called sea supply. Not my term. Admiral Noonan termed that in 2019 and asked me to further define it, which I've done. We'll get into that a little bit later. So I say all of this because this is the strategic basis on which Australia acted from Federation right up until World War II. If we don't understand the strategic basis, we can't really understand how we managed to defend the place. So these are the themes we're looking at. I won't be doing PowerPoint for the blind. Basically, the Australian governments did an awful lot between the wars to sustain Australia's ability to defend itself. What did that mean? What did defending Australia actually mean? It meant keeping the sea lanes open. It's really hard to invade Australia, even with the massive strategic advantage the Japanese had of only being 600 miles from Australian territory, Papua New Guinea, when they were up in the mandates and occupying those positions, the old German colonies in the Central Pacific. So what does that mean? Firstly, Australia can't defend itself. We're dependent on maritime trade. It is absolutely no coincidence that Australia has always permanently married itself to the globally dominant maritime power. We can't defend Australian trade, which covers the entire world ocean. That watch, that came from Japan, but parts of it were made in Europe. Your phones, the supply chain for those is around about 12,000 items. And they're made globally. And we live in the middle of the second globalisation, if we're still lucky. So what does that actually mean? Well, we have to work in an alliance framework. What does that mean? Well, military allies are the obvious one. What about economic partnerships and economic interdependencies? And again, they all depend on ships, because nothing gets in or out of Australia except by ship, basically. Airliners, yeah, they carry about 1 million tonnes of cargo a year. Just the amount of coal exported from the port of Newcastle, mostly to Japan, in 2025 was 155 million tonnes. That's an awful lot of cargo. That's a single cargo from a single port. And it's sea supply for the Japanese. So none of these are simple questions. Now, back then we were part of the British Empire. What did that mean? Well, it was a very complex structure. Mostly it wasn't an empire at all. Mostly it was an economic arrangement with a number of strategic alliances shot through it. The old view of people running around knocking native civilizations on the head, that kind of thing, that's a great description of the first British Empire. The Americans killed that in between 1776 and 1783. The second British Empire was a radically different beast. And that's why the last British soldiers left Australia in the 1860s. Why? Because they took the view after Lord Durham's report of 1838 that if you can self-govern, go ahead and self-govern. We've got no interest in governing you. But we can offer you this really good economic package, plus trade, plus finances, plus all sorts of other goodies, which will keep you in this economic strategic structure called the British Empire. So to do this, we have to really look at that. And the empire is very important in the 1920s. It's also in diabolical trouble. So that means having a quick look at the so-called Singapore strategy. I say so-called because it was so-called. This is the British view of the world. It's still the European and American view of the world. I show this all the time. It's a really useful tool. If anyone wants a copy of it, just ask. So it's a Mercator projection. Russia's enormous. Look at the size of Greenland. This is 1912. This is on the 1st of January that year. Every British merchant ship reported its position. I don't bother to show the European side because A, I don't care. B, it just shows local trades. The structure of our global trade has not changed. The only difference between that and what's happening today is the Panama Canal's open in late 1913. All of these trades still exist, and they follow the same routes. Why? Because they're least speed, time, distance paths, which translates to lowest cost. How cheap is it? Well, I recently looked at moving a container from Rotterdam to Australia, $6,000. $4,000 of that was getting it across the docks in Sydney. So this is the sort of thing you're looking at. That structure still exists. I won't go into the details of it, you get the general picture. Next one. Come on, you can do it. So Australia's part of a sea power empire. Sea power empire dominates the world ocean. Remember, we want to be allied with the globally dominant maritime power for very good reasons. That's how we survive as a nation. We survive by trade. The world's an ocean. Third point there, sea in red. Really shocks Navy. This is why I get hate mail from navalists occasionally for saying things like this. Navies don't matter, except that they mean you can use the sea commercially without any people like annoying pirates and such and rogue states stopping you from doing so. Navies, and if you look at the history from 1546 when the Royal Navy formed, it's as clear as day, navies are second order effects of commercial use of the sea. So something that is not widely understood. Sea powers fight economically. What was our war against Japan in World War II? It was mostly an economic war. Were we ever going to be able to defeat Japan unilaterally? Had there been a one-on-one war between Australia and Japan, how long would we have lasted? But as part of an alliance structure, what did we do? We blockaded them. We swept, didn't allow any nations at all outside the periphery of the Japanese Empire as expanded in 1942 to trade with them. And then we went in, the Allied we, us, the Americans, the Dutch, the British, and we went in there and we cut their commercial use of the sea. Japan would have been defeated by 1946 without a single bomb being dropped on it. Why? Because they couldn't feed themselves and they couldn't get a single ship into their ports by about 3 weeks before the war ended due to pressure mines. Second point there. CSS Shenandoah, raider, caused a heck of a stir when she turned up in Melbourne in 1865, refitted, repaired, re-ammunitioned as well, which is something that's not terribly widely known, and got a whole bunch of new crew members. The colonies had already seen this as an issue. The vessel above there is almost unknown to history. She's a Victorian colonial warship, the first major one, HMVS Victoria, 1855. And they purchased her specifically to dominate Bass Strait. Why? Because in 1855, the gold rushes were in full flight, and all sorts of interesting people were gravitating towards Bass Strait looking to knock off ships carrying a fortune in gold, English, whatever. How big was that trade? When the Royal Charter, the Golden Wreck, was wrecked on Mulfree Point in Wales in 1856, she had about 1.5 tons of gold on board, officially. Passengers probably had as much again at least. They're still finding it. People are still diving on that wreck and pulling out bits of gold. So at that stage, what are we trading? Well, pretty much a bit of copper, gold, but that gold kick-started an economic revolution in the colonies. The British then said, hang on, there's a lot of money to be made, we've got to look after these trades. And then technological developments kick in with the development of the iron sailing ship, specifically developed for the Australian long-haul trades. Why? Because we grew a lot of wheat. Now, wheat was the oil, if you will, of the 19th century. By the 1870s, Australia is a major source of wheat. Why are the British importing wheat? Well, so that they don't have to grow it themselves. Why do they want to grow it themselves? Because they need those people. That's all right. Is it slipping or?
It's just the leather jackets. It makes an odd sound. I'm just going to see if
Okay.
it's good.
I'm glad it's a jacket making odd sounds and not me. So what the British are doing is they're moving the population out of essentially subsistence agriculture into the factories to power the first globalisation that they kicked off around 1750, but it really took off from 1820. By 1880, the British don't want to grow food, they can import it. Essentially, they've outsourced their farms to Australia, Canada and New Zealand. By 1880, they're starting to move meat, canned meat at that stage. By the 1890s, we're moving chilled and frozen beef halfway across the planet. Please consider how cheap sea transport has to be that a cheap bulk cargo like wheat can be moved across half the planet in a sailing ship with a crew of 20 men and sold at a significant profit. This never happened before in human history. So the British, they used their global dominance to control the world's sea lanes, chart everything, and nobody disagrees. No one thinks this is a bad idea. You won't find French warships stopping British survey ships in French colonial waters charting those. Why? Because they share that information with everybody. Also other information sources. The final point is just really a throwaway. The British had their own way of war, and you can see it very, very clearly in what they called the Great War in the 19th century, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. That is, had a little tiny army, a really, really good one, and a bunch of continental allies. They swept French trade from the ocean, made an awful lot of money, gave the money to the continental allies so they could fight on their side with the mass army, and used their own army to tie down around 15 times that number of troops scattered around the coast of Europe because they might land those 20 or 30,000 men anywhere. And that is how a sea power fights a war. And that is how Australia fought World War II. Well, Phase 2 and Phase 3 of World War II. Distant war. World War I was a distant war. It was an industrial war. It proved to Australia we didn't have any industry. And it proved that we were a great source of troops for the British Empire and the cause and all of that. And we could do some local stuff locally because we had actually built ourselves a very serious navy. Turnkey operation, it is true, and most of the officers were British, but we had done it. And they came out of that with these lessons. This is a material war. This is an industrial war. It's the third industrial war. US Civil War, Russo-Japanese War, then this one. Everyone gets the lesson. If you have a look at that, that's one day's firing in one of the big bombardments on the Somme in 1918. My grandfather was an artilleryman in that particular war. One of the reasons I'm very happy, James, and Nick, to have supported this, memory of my grandfather. That's the lesson we drew. We have to industrialise. We can't just be a source of manpower and food. Mostly because we couldn't move most of the food. Why? Because we were the furthest source. The British, short of tonnage, had to use their ships more efficiently, and they're more efficient on shorter runs. So we industrialised, and from 1919 to 1939, there's a bipartisan, highly effective strategy across Australia of industrialising. It works brilliantly. And Dr. Andrew Ross, his Armed and Ready, 1998, and his 2-volume series, The Great Power Struggle for Australia, well worth reading. It runs through how we did this. Ran out of room to do Navy, unfortunately, but it does focus on industry as built to support Army predominantly and Air Force secondarily. By the way, the whole key to it, the cheapest possible electricity. That's why we built the state grids in the 1920s. So they do that, and the British have a problem. They've got 2 hemispheres of strategic responsibility, but only 1 hemisphere worth of navy. So there's a lot of argument going back and forth. How do we do this? The Singapore strategy comes out of that. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because uniquely amongst the Dominions, Australia had a serious navy. Those naval stations, these are the 1935 stations, modified for a big debate that was going on in 1937. So Australia Station was operated entirely by the Royal Australian Navy. All of the others are British. We're the only people with the naval power to run our own station. And that's unique. No one else is doing that. Why are we doing that? Let's get back to this whole, it's an island thing. And Australians tended to understand it. Back in those days, how did you get to and from Australia to anywhere else? By ship. So everyone knew this because the way you got here, and even if I was in Brisbane and I wanted to go to Sydney to do some business, well, up until about 1933, 34, I'm taking a ship. I can't drive, there's no roads, and the rail connections are patchy to say the least. I'll talk a bit more about these hatched areas later. That was a debate going on in 37. So, 1919 to 1939, we're saying, right, we need to industrialise because if something like that happens again, and looking around the world, it's pretty likely. What do we need to do? We need to do more than just provide food, not much of that because there's not enough ships, and an army. And we have to be able to defend this place. Oh, and the Americans just forced us to cancel the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1923, which we were going to sign up to, the British, for another 10 years, because they don't like the Japanese very much, so there's tensions there. Oh, by the way, that just converted a very good ally into a potential enemy. And if you read Arthur Marder's Old Friends, New Enemies, you'll understand how massive that strategic change was for us. So we planned for a distant war. We planned for another war where Australia's perfectly safe, and we send a major expeditionary force. This time, of course, it's Army, Navy and Air Force. And that was the plan. And that's why we had no fighters in production in this country, as Tom will cover, in the early phases of the Second World War. We weren't going to fight here. We were going to fight overseas. So what did we wind up fighting? We fought a distant war until end of 1941, then oops, the Japanese are in. Then we have a defensive war to fight, and finally we have an offensive war. But back in the 1920s and 30s, those are outside the range of strategic planning. That's outside guidance. How do we manage to do that then, successfully in World War II? Well, that goes to how well we'd postured ourselves industrially by 1939. It turned out that in planning for a distant war and building your industries to provide the army with an awful lot of munitions, to be able to clothe those men, feed them, house them, equip them and arm them, you build up industries which can do something really, really unusual and which government did not understand. Where's Joel? Joel will talk about this. At least I hope someone asked him the question. He thought, I will, Joel. Government doesn't understand industry. Sure as heck didn't understand industry back in those days. So they built industry for a single strategic purpose. Then the strategy changed. Industry was flexible enough. What they'd actually bought was flexibility, that it could pivot on a sixpence, as they said in those days, and address these two different kinds of wars. We fought 3 different wars in World War II. You've seen the British view, that's the Australian view of the threat we faced in that era. I use this map a lot, it's highly effective. Ignore these are AIS tracks for modern merchant shipping flows. Here's the structure of the British Empire, that's its industrial heartland, this is its demographic and trade heartland. The Indian Ocean's absolutely critical to it. Why? Because that's where most of their markets are. So we run this context. We have got to direct, coordinate and sustain all of this. Government, again, didn't understand this point. That's a synergy. So when distant war, oops, we now have to fight in defence of the continent, we need to totally recast what industry produces. That's the answer they came up with. Government could not do it. All of that was developed for one kind of war and wound up supporting 2 radically different wars. Quick note on the Singapore strategy. We look at it through the lens of 1942. Sorry, not correct. Go back to 1920 when it was invented. What was it? It was a trade protection strategy. The Japanese have been allies. The British didn't have to worry about their infrastructure or basing ships out in the Far East, as they called it, because the Japanese are looking after that. That treaty goes away. Oops, now they might be enemy. We have to not build a base. We're moving from coal-fired fleet to an oil-fired fleet. We need 14 million tonnes of bunker fuel around the world, plus a plan to move the entire fleet to Singapore if we really, really need to. Hang on a minute. That's the Imperial Japanese view. And this is where we're getting quickly into the Eastern War Plan. See that blue line? That's the blockade line. Australia is integrated into this plan. Army, Air Force and Navy all integrated into the Eastern War Plan. Remember that picture I showed you of the stations, the hatched areas? That's where they're hashing out the command and control arrangements for those stations. Fleet comes in here, gets based there, doesn't have to fight the Japanese. Provided it's there, it deters them from moving through the barrier in the Indian Ocean. We then blockade them. we win the war. Pretty much how it turned out in real life. When that nightmare happened, this shows the success of the so-called Singapore strategy. Why? Because the Royal Navy was able to move significant forces into the Indian Ocean and keep them there. And that was the oil bunkering system. They lost the base, yes. But that was only probably about a quarter of the entire system, if that in cost terms it was less than 10%. I mentioned very, very quickly this term of sea supply, this bit down here. We'll only talk about that. Sea supply is the essential equipment, the essential material you import and export, without which you can't keep fighting the war. Now, if it's maintained, yep, an island state cannot be defeated. You might get battered and bruised, but you're not going to be defeated. If it's disrupted, you might be first to come to terms at the worst, but again, you can probably still prosecute a defensive war. Only if it's degraded are you forced to surrender. It's that essential subset of maritime trade without which you can't fight the war. By the way, Japan, South Korea today are absolutely dependent on Australian energy and partially dependent on food. Oh, and the Chinese? Pretty much totally dependent on the oil traffic going through the Straits of Hormuz that the Americans now control. That is not a bad thing strategically for Australia. Really quickly, this is the increase in defence spending you saw from the Manchurian incident of September 1931. At this point, the services are saying to government, we can't spend any more money. We've maxed out our industry and we've bought everything we can possibly buy overseas. We're not seeing a similar response today. Quick summary. We had a bipartisan industrial plan, ran for 20 years. It was a smashing success. By 1942, Australia was producing so much military equipment, ammunition, aircraft, even though not the best ones, artillery, small arms, and able to equip sufficient forces that had the Japanese been able to implement their always theoretical plan to land 2 area armies at Port Stephens, they would have been annihilated by the ANF, let alone the AIF. Have a look at, again, Andrew Ross's work on that. The industry side worked. The Commonwealth War Book did not. Why? The government didn't understand industry. They hadn't done an industrial audit, big lesson they applied after the war, but the industry they did build was remarkably flexible when put in the hands of people who understood it. Government does not understand industry, full stop. And we can all think in our own heads as to examples of that in the current era. Finally, Army. This is, should there be a rerun of the Pacific War due to an unfortunate event, about 1 more minute, mate, if that, this is what Army will be doing. The reason Army's getting a bunch of LSTs and the reason Army has gotten long-range fires, think of it as really long-range coast defence, is to do this sort of thing, to provide the logistics spine and the backup. That is Manus Island in 1944. There's 200,000 Americans there. Every single one of those buildings was built here in Australia. Most of the small craft you can see built here in Australia for the US military. That's Milne Bay in 44. Try and avoid that, that's the Mount Hood blowing up. This is the reason why I'm a Corbettian, and this is a fundamentally Corbettian response, as in a sea power response. It sounds strange to say it, sir, but the Army in this country, in an island state, is as sea power oriented a force as the Navy is. For all of those reasons, we can see way back into history as far back as the Napoleonic Wars. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again to everyone for joining us here this evening. What I'll do is I'll ask a series of questions to the panelists, and then we'll after a little bit of time, if time still permits, we'll throw that open to the floor, and we'll see how we go. The importance of the panel, though, is the transition from what we've learned now. How can we translate that to today? What are the things that that decision makers, military decision makers, political decision makers can take from what we've just learned and bring it forward to the 21st century. So the first question I'd like to ask, and if all three of you may join in, but perhaps Corey, if you'd like to start. What lessons for today's military and political decision makers can be drawn from our World War II challenges, both from a military perspective, but also from that sea control perspective that Mark spoke about?
Yeah, a long list of lessons from what we've just certainly heard, and for those that have read even deeper from the presentations that we've had. I guess the key for me is the government of the day today is attuned to the risks and the environment of which we're operating in, which is a positive start. We're not blind to what's occurring in our region or in the globe, more broadly. So the momentum is certainly starting to build around the types of capabilities we may need, particularly at the start of a war. Because I think most of us know that the army, in particular in my case, the army that you start a war with won't be the army you certainly finish the war with, which is really, I guess, important. And the way I describe it, certainly to those that are in the Fires Brigade today, is how we operate pre-crisis, and then what occurs in conflict needs to be looked through a couple of different lenses, because there's a lot of constraints, rightly so, that are put on us pre-crisis or in build-up of crisis, but certainly it differs to what it will be in war. That could be things like the authorities to engage. We heard, I think, if you think back to the Fort Nepean engagements if I go back to World War I, the 5th of August, at 12:45, 2 hours and 45 minutes after that the British Prime Minister of the day had declared war, the gun at Fort Nepean, the 6-inch gun, was firing. And as we heard, was the first round that was fired by Australians, and many think by all Allied forces in that particular war. And it worked. It had the deterrence effect. It fired across the bow of the SS Fouts. Fouts turned around and went back into Fort Nepean. That's true deterrence, but they didn't go back to the political capital of that particular time and seek permission to do that. It was very much decentralised execution based on a few attempts via flags first to get the ship to turn around, but ultimately by the Royal Australian Garrison artillery to understand and make the judgment that that's what had to happen. And I think today's environment, of course, because of the way or the range that our weapons can range, it is quite complicated pre-conflict, and you of course want these authorities to be very much centralised and held by those with the appropriate delegations. But we might be caught off guard when that first strike comes, and I think we need to understand that. It's how quickly can we dust ourselves off, how well can we be prepared for when that shock will inevitably come. And I think we all need to accept from the lessons we've heard today, with the paucity of assets we have, the size of our territory, and what a potential adversary has at their disposal to strike us across all the different means, we never will be ready. Surprise is important. It's how quickly we adapt going forward.
Thanks, Corey. Don, would you like to take a slightly different approach?
I would. Integrated C2. I'd reflect on what Tom was saying, particularly in that C2 framework wasn't particularly good at the beginning of the war, but he also made the comment that it got a lot better and it was actually in pretty good shape by the end. And that's the piece that is important, because you can detect, you can respond, you have an integrated framework of command and control, and in the modern context, particularly, of integrated air and missile defence. And if, for the gunners in the room in particular, the interesting story and development from 42, 43 onwards was how the C2 around the coastal artillery and the air defence artillery was evolving itself, but particularly how the two were drawn together later into the war. So one of the big things we can learn from the experience of World War II, and we can talk, and Greg, I'm sure, will touch on it a little bit later, is what's happening now. But integrated C2 is a major part of it.
No, great, thank you. Joel, there may be an industry aspect here, particularly in relation to supplies across the sea.
No, thank you very much, gentlemen, for having me this evening. Absolutely. As recognised by industry being now counted as one of the fundamental inputs of capability, industry plays a critical role in deterrence before conflict starts, but also clearly during, when sustainment and supply to what you need, where you need it, is critical. In advance of conflict starting, we believe it is important, we want to help you solve this problem, but industry must have the ability to surge and increase capacity. I have a small privileged insight to say that in comparison to what across Army for some things the range, train, sustain quantities are compared to daily use rates in conflicts like the Ukraine, the ADF's annual amounts amount to in some days, some phases of warfare, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month's use. Now, when you look at the challenges to a supply chain across vulnerable sea lines of communication for sea supply, getting those critical components to Australia, how do you build up stockpiles? How do you have resilience? How do you have the raw material you require? How do you have the capacity in your industries to surge and supply you with what you need? The challenge comes that it is a significant investment. You end up having a dynamic tension between establishing a critical capability to give the ADF the supplies or the material it needs. Do you invest in a factory that can make the race train sustain quantity, or has latent dormant capacity who, if government does their job properly, is never called upon? And then it becomes a balance of risk. And government and our senior leadership make those decisions, and they make those informed conversations, and they come down with where they are. But for industry, we absolutely recognise, and we've been saying this for a long time, you look at anything that's coming out of America on the time to resupply their interceptors after the Iran conflict. Anything that's coming out of Europe for the time to resupply the material being constantly provided to the Ukraine. There is a recapitalisation in military material and industry around the world. We have the tyranny of distance, we have the safety of distance, but we have an element of complacency where we feel that it won't touch us till last, if ever. As someone who is constantly fighting for those raw materials to make the elements that we're privileged to be involved with, it does not get easier in times of conflict.
Excellent, thank you, Joel. So let's move a little bit to perhaps a different approach to the problem of what we've learned so far. So, gentlemen, thinking about what we've heard, what aspects that we've heard about this afternoon aren't applicable? So, is there some part of what we heard about today in the experiences of World War II that are no longer relevant? Do we think that there may be some things that we can't just bring everything forward from 1942 to 1945? Are there some things that we are best left to history? Don, I might start with you.
Actually, I might start it with a comment that Joel just made about distance, about Australia's strategic position in the world and the distance, and that is the bit that has changed. Space capability, the ranges of the weapons and the threat that we face at the moment means that, to a degree, that safety of our strategic position has actually changed. Technology, and now that doesn't mean that a bunch of the planning that we do around leveraging strategic geography and taking advantage of it doesn't need to still be incorporated. And I think it was Mark who said, think of a really, really long-range coast defence capability, which is essentially the littoral manoeuvre projection into the north. So the purest of we're safe, they can't reach us has definitely changed, but we have to incorporate those principles into our planning and consider what projection, what extending even further the ranges of our own systems need to be.
Thank you. Corey, would you like to add something?
I think perhaps it's really the geographic locations of where we might need to deploy. If you think about the raids across sort of northwest, northern Australia. Today, we don't necessarily need to be in all those locations. And I think I'll use the example on, when was it? Monday this week? No, last week. We were on exercise in Puckapunyal. And the new HIMARS capability, which has been introduced into one of the regiments of the Brigade, 14 Regiment, was prosecuting targets into Tasmania from Puckapunyal. Now, if you think about then that risk that you can hold across the Bass Strait from anywhere in Victoria without any adversary knowing where that platform or capability or cache of munitions may be, it's pretty powerful for us too. So I don't think that we necessarily need to forward deploy assets, have our battle positions dug in, or continue to sort of shape in that regard. The real message and key for us is how quickly can we get to these areas based on what the threat is that's confronting us going forward.
Thank you. Joel, how about maybe from an industry perspective, is there are there some things that don't apply today?
I think scaling up is a topic you must be very careful when you look at. Across military capabilities, every piece of material, every technology is different. But if I focus on what we at NIOA do, and that is firearms munitions, especially medium, large caliber munitions, relevant to you gentlemen in this room, the technology that goes into every round you fire, every missile you fire, and every interceptor, that you fire now is so far advanced to what has been used historically. The ability for industry just to retool and make more, it's not that simple. There is significant standards, significant safety, significant engineering effort required to do so and do so safely. When you go to conflict, there's a presumption there that when you go to war, the gloves come off, the rules get thrown out of the war. You just make more, you just go quick, you go hard, you go fast. But when you have one of one facility making that item, that's the wrong time to have an industrial accident, or worse. So the ability to scale and the, not fallacy, but the overuse, or the, I don't know, I'll stay with overuse of dual-use technologies or dual-use industries so they can retool and change across, isn't the solution for every capability. So that's something that I would look at. I know industry, that has been a constant message up. I know the government is aware of this, and yes, they are looking at it, and they are looking for solutions to those things that you can't just retool, remake, reprioritise, and point your industry in a different direction. For those things that there are only single use, like explosives.
Excellent, thank you. So I think in those first two questions that I've asked to all three of the panellists, we can see that as can be expected, there are many things that our experience through the Second World War does teach us, and we can bring forward into today. But equally, there are aspects, both geographic, industrial, or even from a command and control perspective, that don't necessarily bring agency to today. So with those sorts of that balance, I guess, in mind, I'll ask a third question here, and given the fact that it clearly is such a complex thing, bringing forward, learning from the past and bringing forward into today. What might be some decisions or policy standpoints that we may wish to see a future Australian decision makers to take, both at the political level, but also potentially at the industrial or even at the strategic military level, given the fact that, as we've heard today, the importance of the strategic frame that we are sitting in is really the crux of the firepower that we can actually generate at the end of that. If we don't have that strategic firepower facility that's brought about through our strategic positioning, both economic and military, then the capacity for us to take that firepower to the enemy is much reduced. So I'll start with you, Corey. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Look, to me, we're going to win the next war by logistics, particularly with the systems that are within my brigade, and even if you're thinking about the rest of those elements that might contribute to that maritime power. So the more we can do now around our logistics in terms of magazine depths, supplies, and ways to move these assets around, both in Australia and then offshore, to prepare from a policy perspective, but then also to enable us to train at that scale, I think is pretty important. I'm impressed, and most people should be quite comforted in terms of how Australia works with our allies and partners, not only here in Australia, but in the region as well. And I think we've got that right. If you think about the lesson with the Americans and the Australians in World War II, with not necessarily nested objectives or working together, I'd say we're through that. The transparency between, particularly my experience with my US colleagues, has never been better in terms of their openness, their frankness, and their willingness to open the curtains for us to have a look at, and of course for Australia too. So continuing to progress the lines around how we might seek to work together to deter, but then ultimately be prepared. Our plans are nested, our command and control architectures are starting to take shape. I have Australian officers embedded in US organisations such as the Multi-Domain Task Force. I have the Multi-Domain Task Force personnel embedded in my organisation. We could not be closer, nor could we be closer when it comes to our some of our regional partners, particularly those that are viewed as non-aligned. I have not yet had to make a choice. What we're seeing, whether it be from Indonesia, whether it be from the Malaysians and sort of our Southwest Pacific friends, is a real willingness and quite an awakening in terms of just how the situation is currently, and then how they might need to respond, just like Australia would as well, in the defence of our own sovereignty. Most recognise that Australia needs the defence of those nations that are to our north really equals the defence of Australia as well. So policy when it comes to our alliances, our partnerships, flexibility to be able to operate in and out of each of our respective nations, the C2 networks, but most importantly the logistics and starting to build those quantities which we anticipate, because the war will be different. It won't be necessarily Ukraine, but how quickly can we adapt it will be important. And I'll finish by just saying, again, just looking towards our industry partners, is we've got to get closer. We've actually just got to start working with each other at the lower levels. It's that sort of, I think the example of the Ukraine war, a uncrewed aerial system is the software is having to be updated every 7 days. Now I can code a little bit, plenty of gunners out there that can probably code a lot better than me, but it's the industry partners that we need, because once you've worked the software, you then need to work the parts of the system which need to be adapted, and then of course you throw the platform out after 6 months because it's easily defeated. That's just an uncrewed aerial system. It's the same with our munitions, and it's the same with the expense of what some of these critical capabilities that we're starting to introduce, whether it be the precision strike missile. We as military practitioners know that whilst defence industry will provide us with some pretty sophisticated equipment, right, it's not the answer. Tactics needs to play in this game. Mix of munitions. You know, we use the term multi-domain strike for a reason. Just thinking that one platform, one particular effector is going to have the necessary effect we need is the wrong answer. Not only is it across the services, but certainly across the land force, who is generally now, genuinely, a true contributor to the joint force at the ranges of which the demands on the land force from the maritime component commander or the air component commander is quite real and pressing because they recognise the strength that we bring today. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Corey. I might throw to Joel next, and then Don, if you can anchor.
That's absolutely heartening to hear because I would add, in my personal limited time working for NIOA, before that in uniform, the systems that we are all part of work best when you have industry, the capability manager, their representative, the user, and the acquisition agency in the room together, making those decisions together. Now, there is absolutely times where we as industry were asked to leave the room so that Army Headquarters and CASG could talk about things that we didn't need to know, be privy to information that was beyond classification or considerations, but they would come to a decision, give us a direction, and we would execute. But having that tripartite agreement, working together, having all those people in the room allowed the most informed decisions to be made, and it was a step away from the traditional way of acquisitions where it's a very hierarchical agreement, where a service under a material acquisition agreement tells CASG to get after something and they go through their process and it goes down the path and they're done. And in their defence, probably due to some poor behaviour by industries, they don't like to put industry with the users together. There's many pretty excellent examples I could give where things have gone awry because of that. But if everyone's in the room together and they're doing it in front of each other, it's very hard to act foolishly or act improperly. But when it's done together, you can have those conversations, you can generate long-term, enduring, sustainable solutions that meet, exceed and continue to deliver the capabilities needed. And I think all of Australian industries, if I was to be bold and try to speak for as many as possible, would agree that that's what we all want to do for you.
Thanks, Joel. Don.
Thanks, Nick. Look, if I can perhaps try and draw those two threads, the logistics piece and the industrial base piece together in the context of the recent NDS. One of the big themes that is running through the NDS is this idea of self-reliance. It's evolved a little bit from pure sort of sovereign capability to a definition around self-reliance. But one of the key things we have to do is we actually have to understand our industrial base, but it's actually broader than that. We have to understand our national support base. So it's not just the defence industrial base, it is the broader national capabilities and where we have strength or where we are carrying risk. For those who watched the first seminar in this series down in Melbourne a few weeks ago, Peter Layton gave an excellent presentation around some of the actions and activities that had occurred in the early part of World War II in and around the industrial base. And he introduced these ideas of shadow factories and what he called armament annexes. And they were infrastructure and capital facilities and equipment investment paid for by government, but coincident to or adjacent to industry. Not dual use, hey, you've got to pivot when you're told, but this was an investment for the capability. It would in the future leverage the workforce from the other sector's industry when it needed to be able to surge. So this was a fundamental decision around identifying industrial and support risk and making the initial part of the investment for it. Workforce is a whole different piece of this. And what I'm doing now is I'm drawing on, for those, and it wasn't covered when I was introduced, but for those who don't know, I actually still do a little bit of reserve work, and I'm in that strategic mobilisation planning team within VCDF Group in Defence. And so there's been a bunch of us crusty old grey-haired guys having a bit of a look at this for a while now. The framework is essentially a bunch of mobilisation factors for consideration. The 4 key major ones are workforce, infrastructure, industry, critical material, and this goes to some of what Buddy Corey was saying around stockpiling, strategic material reserves, think fuel, EO, health stores, and a few other pieces. And then the fundamental piece all over that, they're the 4 demand factor pieces for mobilisation planning. And then there's a coordination piece that comes with it. There's a bunch of other considerations as sort of enabling elements. But it's about understanding the industrial base, know where you're carrying risk, and where appropriate, invest. Build missile factories. Encourage a range of companies and capabilities to manufacture drones and have the capacity to actually manufacture them at scale, if not now, when needed. So that's the piece, because, and I'll close by saying we've all heard this government over the last few years say that we're in the worst strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War, and then everyone goes, okay, so tell me what you're doing about it, and it's ... silence. But this is the point. Understand where you are carrying risk, do the planning, consider where it is appropriate to invest, and know what you then have to be able to do.
Excellent, thank you. I might take a slightly different tack for the next question. Less about sort of strategic positioning and industrial sort of baselining, and more about some of the new technologies that are coming along at the moment in this 21st century that we're in at the moment. Things that have made a bit of a game changer from what we've seen in previous conflicts. These technologies are not just the weapons of war, but also the means by which we command and control those weapons, and the means by which we actually manufacture those weapons as well. So from an industrial technology, from a C4I technology, and also from a weapons technology. What are some of the things that you gentlemen can see are game changers that are hitting the streets right now that we should be looking forward to? Joel, do you want to start off?
Absolutely. Just of all the things that are out there now that would make a difference in the next war, I certainly think, and it's a deviation from my business, but certainly command and control situation awareness is absolutely critical and will be a game changer in the next conflict. The ADF has an exceptional, this is not much to do with industry in all fairness, but the ADF has an exceptional, well-earned, well-deserved, well-maintained, well-protected history of investing in your junior commanders and trusting your junior commanders. That level of command that level of trust and investment is critical and will be critical to future warfare. Once you go into a conflict where the RF spectrum becomes degraded, denied, hostile, challenged, if you don't have that level of trust, you don't have that level of competency and capability in your junior commanders across the force to execute their mission, then that is challenged. That is problematic, but I think the ADF has always been and is continuing to go and invest in the right direction doing so. On the materiel side, certainly the absolute, have the privilege of working with an exceptionally smart scientist who can do scary things with household chemicals professionally. That means that the investment in insensitive munitions, insensitive materials, energetic materials to deliver an effect, to do more with less is critical. When you're working with explosives, hands-on as a user, and they throw the P for plenty rule at you, that's fantastic. That's good fun in training because it's a big bang and you feel it in your chest. But when you go to war, P for plenty is not the way to work. You want to achieve your effect with the least amount as possible, because if you can only make I'll do some easy math because I'm not smart. If you can only make 100 kilos of explosives per batch, but you can achieve that effect against your target with 1 kilo, you can now make 100 warheads, compared to using something less effective, less energetic, when it was 2, 3, 5 kilos. So you're infinite, and that is increasing what you're doing. If that's an insensitive munition, that means that getting it from the place where it's made to the place where it's delivered, getting it through all the levels of hand and delivery to you, so that on the front line where it is needed safely, and it will still perform as advertised, that is critical. Because again, I talked earlier about the rules that matter. We understand how critical it is that that item is, and it's safe and suitable for service is the phrase. But when you load that into your cannon, or where you put that into the pod, or when you go to employ that it absolutely functions as designed. Because yes, I'm industry, yes, I'm about material, but I think it's harder to grow professional soldiers and replace professional soldiers than it is to make another thing. So that's why our side is to make sure that the things are as safe as possible so that you can continue to do your mission.
Thanks, John. Don?
For me, it's a great little thread I like to pull. Loitering munitions, one-way effectors, data processing at the edge is a phenomenal combination that has and will continue to change. You know, for those of the gunners in the room, again, there's a few of us here, so why not? You know, when I was a young gunner, there was the running joke of the bombs are in the air, where do you want them? Well, they are, is the bottom line now, with loitering munitions, with the targeting capabilities that we have, with the data processing. You know, this is actually revolutionising the way. There's a bunch of other technologies, many of which enable that, many of which are, you know, coincident or have a synergy with those. But that's one of my little favourites, and I'll throw it out there.
I like loitering munitions, I like them a lot, but without a payload, it's just a hobby drone. So the critical part of that is not the energetic material, it is now the fusing, the safe handling device. There is lots of imagery around of hand-jammed indirect fire mortar artillery fuses have been overridden, had the setback removed so that you can just zip tie that to a drone and send it forward. But at a point in time, even the Ukrainians, who are in a fundamental fight for survival, turned around and said, we're not doing that anymore, we're losing more people because on takeoff the drone caught a gust of wind and hit the ground, and that warhead detonated at our own feet. They lost more people to their own munition than they were killing Russians. So it's the investment, and for us it's the investment in new and novel fuse types that are safe to handle, safe to carry, safe to employ, that haven't had to have all those critical functions overridden. Again, safety is critical, weirdly, but you do a very dangerous job well, but you've got to do it safely, otherwise the enemy wins regardless. But yeah, so fusing on those devices and the growth of those munitions and warheads, because I think at a time of conflict, Australia there are many, many small companies and there are many 3D printers out there that could churn out all the FPV drones. Now, presuming that there was a common ground control system, and assuming there was a standard so that the trainability for your users and your operators and your program could actually just pick it up, and it didn't matter what payload they pull out of the box today, it was gone. But the thing you bolt to it must be safe to deliver the effect.
Good point.
What's the
Corey,
so I mean, what's the game changer for the next war? I think, you know, if you look across both the sensing, the deciding, and then the effector, there are some exquisite technologies out there, but they're not going to win the war. I think Army and our leadership, certainly by General Stewart and others, is we really are starting to form this central idea of constant adaptation. To me, that's going to be the game changer for us. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to start with removing some of those levels of bureaucracy which we've had to endure for very good reasons, but recognising that's not going to work for us, you know, in the start of a conflict. The analogy that the Army is beginning to use is for our adaptation is one at the unit level. Effectively, if you're thinking about an analogue clock, the seconds hand is how fast at the unit level we need to be adapting. That's how quick we need to be recoding or readapting some of the weapons that may be given to us. So the right to repair and the right for our soldiers or sailors or aviators to manipulate these systems, make them better, work out how to respond to the counter systems that the adversary has is important. At the Army level, that adaptation loop is moving at about the minute hand, right? It's a little bit slower, a few more resources, and probably some more novel technologies. And then, of course, at the government or even potentially the industrial base, it's moving at that sort of hour hand. So what Army is seeking to do is, rather than hold all the resources up at the level and get particular decisions sort of held at centralised level, it's to give the resources in terms of money or ideas down to that lower level. And the Brits are starting to use that philosophy of the 20-40-40 when it comes to their investments of capabilities. 20% will be spent on the exquisites, those things that people think will win the war. 40% is sort of around those autonomous systems, those things that can help us bring mass to the fight, make things easier for us and more survivable. And then that final 40%, they're the expendables. It's the one-way attack drones, it's the counter-UAS systems, but they're cheap and they assist and they play an important role with increasing our probability of kill when I have to use the exquisite systems, because we won't use them on their own. Mix of systems against certain targets, true multi-domain strike going forward. So, not one panacea, unfortunately. We know that. History's told us that. How quickly we adapt and how fast we can adapt. And if we're adapting fast in the adversary, that's the game changer.
Absolutely, well said. Gentlemen, what I might do now is take the opportunity to open to the floor for any questions that the people from the floor may wish to ask the panel. When I pick you out, can I ask you please to stand up, not to identify yourself necessarily, but to give a loud version of the question so that the recording can hear, and I'll, if necessary, translate and pass it on so that it can be captured for future. But the floor is open, ladies and gentlemen, for any questions that may be out there.
Good evening, gentlemen, sirs. Question for yourself, sir, and interested in hearing from everyone on the panel, of course, but for yourself, sir, Command 10 Brigade. With the Army's increased focus on littoral manoeuvre, but with our stretch demands remaining beyond just mastering that focus, do you think we should be bold in just committing to mastering littoral manoeuvre, and say adopt existing doctrine like the US Marine Corps, for example, or forge our own path? And what are we doing in the raise, train, sustain area at the moment? My understanding is that we're still kind of using existing training models and adding on. Should we just blaze a new path? And what are we doing in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it requires novel thought by all. I mean, littoral manoeuvre is not something new for Army. We didn't really hear about the size of the Army vessels which were operated by Army. Right? Huge numbers of ships. Yeah, some and many reliant on the sort of US Army and certainly the British Army. But the way that we're heading in terms of the size and types of our particular ships being introduced into Australia is quite substantial. But we can't seek to just be using it the way that we may have used it in the past. And manoeuvring within the littoral is just important. It's not about just the platform that these things are on, but it's the whole operation that it's around it. I think Army has probably recognised we're too heavy for our region. It takes too much to move us. Therefore, some real sort of thought and investment is starting to look at how we are trying to lighten our combat force, particularly when it comes to our combat brigades who may be operating in the region. And then even when it comes to the capabilities within the Fires Brigade, we've got to work out how we can become more deployable within sort of the constraints that we have. We're never going to have enough vessels to move us around, just like we're probably never going to have enough weapon systems required or munition stocks behind us. But I talked about the logistics probably being our weakness, as is in most wars, getting heavier and putting more of a bill on sort of our own littoral manoeuvre ships, or even resupply ships that follow behind that, is probably not necessarily the right answer. The techniques associated with it, again, we're moving at pace. I think for the first time, certainly in my sort of 30-odd year career, major systems are leading us, and the rest of that fundamental inputs into capability, which we talked about, is actually trying to play catch up. I mean, I've got more launches now than I have the sort of technicians to keep these things going, or more staff in terms of the gunners to operate it. The littoral manoeuvre ships, the steel's getting cut, or aluminium, I think it might be in that case. Now. So we need to all work on all those other picks, whether it be the doctrine, the supplies, and certainly the workforce, which is pleasing with the Littoral Manoeuvre Group. I think the Chief of Staff is in the room now. They're established, the headquarters is established. We've leased equipment to start to work out how we might want to operate similar systems in the future. And we're beginning to think about how manoeuvre supports things like fires, not fires supporting manoeuvre, which is an important distinction. And again, at the joint force level, that's well understood.
Joel, any thoughts from your perspective?
Absolutely. It's interesting you raised the US Marine Corps, potentially thinking something like the Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. Always draw parallels to the US Marine Corps, but we have to also be cognizant that the US Marine Corps is part of the Department of Navy, so they have the US Navy to back them up. But the Marines bring some excellent lessons that could be applied maybe, and that's looking at how they do their resupply, their conscious decisions to rationalise and simplify down to the smallest number of items. If you've ever had the pleasure of being embarked on Australian LHD for any period of time, or even just the planning to go onto an LHD, you'll realise how precious lane meters are, the NEQ that goes into those magazines, and how many natures of ammunition and the mix of natures of ammunition, and how it is, it's 3D Tetris at best on a good day, and it's horrible if you start trying to introduce something new and novel. As you look at your littoral manoeuvre and you look at that capacity to deliver or to deploy those long-range assets to locations where your enemy does not know or doesn't expect it to be, to impart a cost on them or a dilemma on them, you've then got to look at how do I resupply them once they've achieved that mission, because it's no point putting you gentlemen forward, or ladies and gentlemen forward, having you expend your first line, your missiles, your payload, and then go, now what? So it becomes that conscious decision, looking for that logistics efficiency across the service, across the services, where you can look at who's doing what and how you then also plug into the joint battle force. For industry, that makes sense to us because we then go, excellent, we can now rationalise and look at the most efficient and effective way to deliver those capabilities in the volumes required. So we're making more of a few things rather than a lot of a few things, a few of a lot things, sorry, back to front. So it becomes math. For those of it, the older people, those of us in the room, the ADF Army almost broke itself trying to deploy a battalion into East Timor. The logistics to get the first soldiers, the first battalion into East Timor and sustain them was tough back then. I am nowhere informed to have any sort of judgment on what we are right now, but if we're now looking to go well forward of that point with strategic capabilities embarked on littoral vessels that need protection, resupply, that logistics is key. And if you can do that the best way possible, industry can support you.
I'll just say we do have a lot to learn from the Marines, and we still do, whether it be just the littoral manoeuvre, but also from the strike. I mean, the drug running boats that are sort of popping up across the Pacific in Fiji and Tonga. I mean, the Marines are using similar type vessels, drug running boats, for their resupply of their munitions for their strike systems. So we learn a lot. That's why we've got people embedded inside. We're not in this alone.
We don't have embeds with the drug cartels, though.
Yeah, that's right.
Don, any thoughts?
No, just a quick one. Littoral manoeuvre supports projection. Projection is what contributes to the deterrence through denial. That's the strategy. The projection helps us deny an enemy's approaches, creates, as was mentioned, a dilemma in his mind, and contributes to that deterrence piece. It does support long-range fires and strike, absolutely. But to me, that's the core of effective littoral manoeuvre.
Thank you. I think we've got time for probably one more question.
I might just add to that as a Chief of Staff for the Littoral Manoeuvre Group. So, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Dr. Lee, Chief of Staff for the Littoral Manoeuvre Group. We are getting 3 battalions of landing craft, based in Brisbane, North Queensland and Darwin, and each of those landing craft battalions will be able to significantly enhance our ability to force protect, and it links directly to the DSR and the NDS to lift 10 brigade assets with security elements from the other brigades to achieve that mission set of denial that Brigadier Roach just mentioned. So we've got the opposite problem, sir. We've got people before the boats. So we've got trained crews. Our officers are doing the Maritime Warfare Officer course with Navy. We're getting upskilled with our sergeants and corporals and TAFE. And we're training them on leased vessels, farming onto Navy, L-class ships and the like. So by the time the vessels turn up, they'll be ready to then work those landing craft, drill them up to achieve mission sets that we're directed to. So there's a lot of significant enhancements in addition to what the LHDs can do with lifting that heavy armour and other assets that we can do with the new littoral vessels once they get in.
Thanks, Khalid. So one more question. I think we've picked it here.
Gents, just a quick question around, we talked about long-range fires, manning, materials. At what point are we starting to look at AI and automation to take over some of those menial tasks for not only manufacturing of ammunition and capabilities, but also a part of the decision-making process to take the heat off commanders when they're identifying and prosecuting targets?
We'll start with Corey.
Yeah, I guess there's 2 things there. One in terms of AI, so helping the decision makers make decisions, but then also the workforce or the autonomous piece, which might not only provide you more mass, but free up your sort of valuable resource, your human resource, for other areas. I talked about that sort of investment of 20, 40, 40, and that middle bracket from the British philosophy is how they're sort of getting after it. I'd have to say Army's pretty close in terms of beginning to go down that road. We use 5.7 RAR up in Darwin at the moment as our sort of RAS at scale, so the autonomous systems at scale sort of unit to continue to sort of progress these. If I think about my own or the capabilities that are resident within the Fires Brigade, we're already looking in terms of what the next platform looks like, the weapon system. If we needed to be able to fire a different mix of different missiles, a little bit longer, a little bit further range, then removing the cab and having it as an autonomous system gives us a lot more flexibility. And there's a joint venture called the CAML, Common Autonomous Missile Launcher, which certainly Australia is interested in co-developing, because that will free up resource, give us a little bit more mass, and then also, again, provide questions for any adversary over what is in that common system. Is it defensive strike? Is it offensive strike? Is it tomahawks that can go out a couple of thousand, or is it short-range systems which might be targeting lower threats as well? So, autonomous, we're getting there. I can only speak for where we're at, but it's certainly part of it. And then On the AI and decision making, everything that we're sort of introducing now has almost an AI component to it. I talked about the third MDTF, that multi-domain task force, in terms of trying to better understand what's going on. There is a lot of the artificial intelligence behind that. But even the systems we use today, it is getting better at distilling the information for us, understanding, and then even starting to then look at what it might how might we have to respond and what options we might have at it. A couple of novel Australian Defence Industry weapon systems, which we are trialling, has AI associated with it in terms of its visual acquisition of what it thinks and what it's deciding to do, be it with the loitering systems that we have. So it's starting to filter out there. You're not going to get a big bang and our political masters standing next to big shiny things that says, here's AI. It's just going to permeate throughout the force, and I think that's probably the best way to use it.
Don?
Not a lot to add. The AI supporting decision making, it adds to the speed of decision making, which is actually the key here. The speed of correct decision making. There's a whole debate out there about trusted AI, about making sure that there are mechanisms to ensure that the data that is being brought to the tools and the way in which it is supporting decision making, that is really important. And we need to continue to make sure that we're eyes wide open in relation to the level of trust and security in the framework in the way we use AI.
Thanks. Joel, any last thoughts?
Absolutely. On two elements of, firstly, the production side, of course, we'll use everything we can to make our production as efficient, as optimised as possible. That cuts down costs, it cuts down price, it increases volume, it does everything that we aspire to. So yeah, absolutely. Trust plays a critical part in that, because like anything, you want to make sure that the AI is doing what it promises on the tin. It's not having hallucinations, but it meets, but it's not deviating. Part of that is the regulatory framework in which we operate. Sometimes that framework just will not change to allow AI. It still could be very mandrolic or have absolute checks and balances in place for good reason. But where possible, where we can, absolutely. In munitions design, weapons design, again, absolutely. I think you'll find that though, the art of the possible compared to the actual what is being done is limited by that trust. Western military is Australian. We apply laws of armed conflict. We have all the different rules and policies that you operate under to make sure that there is trust. Army were, personal opinion, if I'm wrong, please don't at me, but slower to adopt or trust autonomous systems for engagements. The Navy with their Aegis system, with their fleet defence systems, to let the CIWS fight, defend, fire the SM2s, defend the boat, much quicker to allow, and that is an autonomous system under another name, to allow when all those cruise missiles are attacking the surface action group or the carrier action group, allow the system to defend the fleet. Like that, because it will detect, identify, react quicker than people can communicate and do the same. That is, Navy, Air Force have been fighting in a recognised air picture for decades. Army, it's a much more confused, not as clean operating environment. But you are absolutely catching up because you're aware of the advantages it gives you, but you must trust. Armies are given a solemn authority to take another life lawfully. And you must do so, and you carry that burden with you, and you conduct that task to do so. And you can't do it flippantly. If you're going to trust a machine to do that for you, you must authorise that machine or make sure the machine is doing it properly as intended, as designed. And therefore, it's lots of checks and balances, both in the design, but also in the selection and introduction into service of a capability that does that. That may not feel quick, and it may not feel as quick as our adversaries, but our enemies, it is our enemies, don't value human life like you do. And I think that's a strength of ours, not a weakness.
Thank you, Joel. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 2 hours of belt-fed theory, concepts, ideas. Let me try and sum that up in about 100 words if I can. Firstly, understanding that for the defence of Australia, then and now, this is a layered approach. It didn't start at the beaches and the dunes it started from Australia. It went all the way out, and it still does. So that idea of starting our defence at range remains a fundamental aspect of Australia's defence strategy. Secondly, the synergy that was raised firstly with Mark and then echoed through the panel discussion talks about whether it be multi-domain warfare, whether it be understanding how Air Force can vector and can slew enemy forces on from other services. The capacity for littoral projection, which of course is that confluence between all of the three physical domains, and increasingly now the convergence of the other two of space and cyber as well. The enduring nature of the warfighting functions, which we heard about right from the outset from both Mark and from Tom. The centrality of that command and control, which remains pivotal today. The situational understanding, which in 1942 was letting us down, but remains vital in that targeting matrix that Corey was taking us through a second ago. The force application, which is the capacity for us to use that targeting to apply and exploit the technology that we have now to ensure that the precious amount of explosive and kinetic material that we have at our disposal is applied in the most surgical and effective fashion. The protection that we need from the outset, whether that be looking at our sea lanes of communication, all the way back through the various our population centres, our ports, our seaboards, our staging posts. And then when we start to look at the force generation and sustainment that we need is also a fundamental part of not only the war effort that we required back in the Second World War, but we will need in the future. The final one, which is perhaps the most difficult one, is that force projection. How do we pick up a force, place it at distance and hold it there, and hold our adversary at risk? The capacity to do that is probably the acme of a military power, and it's one that we will continue to wrestle with through the rest of this century. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you all to thank our panel and also our two speakers beforehand, and I'll quickly hand over to James.